Winter, 1945. The storm arrived without warning. First a thin curtain of snow drifting across the treetops, then a wall of white swallowing the forest whole. By late afternoon, the world had vanished into a blinding haze where sky and earth became the same endless sheet of frozen light. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Wind roared like a living thing, dragging snow across the open road in violent spirals. Along that road moved a small column of German female POWs, communications auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, women pulled from collapsing units as the Western Front fell apart. Their boots sank into drifts so deep that each step felt like climbing out of a grave. Their breath crystallized instantly. Some clutched thin coats. Others held on to one another for balance. A few simply folded into the snow, unable to rise again. Their American escorts knew the storm was turning lethal. Visibility had dropped to arm's length. The wind erased tracks as quickly as they formed. Every minute the temperature fell another degree. And then a voice, shaking, desperate, cut through the storm. "Please, don't let us die here." It was the moment when survival, mercy, and war collided in the heart of a whiteout. And to understand how these women reached this point, we must return to the world that shaped their fate. In the final winter of the war, Germany's military machine was collapsing faster than it could rebuild itself. By late 1944, the Reich had exhausted its reserves of fuel, of ammunition, of manpower. The fighting strength that once stormed across Europe had been reduced to scattered formations struggling to hold ground. They no longer had the ability to defend. Every front was retreating, every road led backward, every horizon carried the sound of defeat. As the Wehrmacht thinned, the German High Command turned increasingly to women to fill roles once reserved for trained soldiers. These were not frontline combatants. They were telephone operators, cryptographers, typists, Red Cross nurses, flak auxiliaries, map clerks, radio listeners. Thousands of young women drafted into the collapsing support structure of a war that demanded more than Germany could give. By the winter of 1945, many of these women found themselves far closer to the front than they had ever expected to be. The retreat from the Ardennes, the pullback from Alsace, the fragmentation of units along the Rhine, all of it created pockets where female auxiliaries became stranded between retreating German formations and advancing American forces. Trains were overloaded or destroyed. Trucks broke down in frozen valleys. Roads vanished beneath snowstorms that swept across Western Europe in January and February. In normal conditions, these women would have been processed and evacuated safely. But the war in early 1945 was anything but normal. Winter hit with a severity not seen in years. Temperatures dropped below 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. Frostbite cases surged in both armies. And along remote forest roads, small groups of German female personnel were captured not after battle, but after wandering through collapsing supply corridors, looking for their own units. American troops who encountered them often found women exhausted, underfed, and ill-prepared for the brutal weather. Many had been hastily evacuated from headquarters or signal posts with little more than a coat and a pair of gloves. Some had marched for days. Others had not eaten properly since leaving their stations. The retreat had stripped away organization, turning even administrative movements into desperate flights. By regulation, female POWs were to be moved away from potential combat zones as quickly as possible. But winter had turned roads into hazards and routes into traps. Snowfall erased landmarks. Blizzards made navigation nearly impossible. Columns, military or prisoner, could wander off the intended path without realizing it. These conditions framed the moment in the blizzard. A mixed group of German female auxiliaries, held by a small American detachment, whose responsibility was simple in theory: escort them to a rear area processing point. But theory did not survive the storm that night. For American soldiers, the Geneva Convention was more than a legal directive. It was part of the U.S. Army's standing culture. Even in freezing weather, even when supplies were tight, they were expected to protect prisoners under their control. For the women, however, the expectation was entirely different. Many had grown up under years of Nazi propaganda portraying Americans as brutal and merciless. They believed surrender meant abuse or abandonment. That fear intensified with the cold, with hunger, and with the sight of a storm powerful enough to erase a life in minutes. The blizzard hit at a moment when neither escort nor prisoners could turn back. Whiteout conditions made retreat as dangerous as continuing forward. The nearest American aid station was several kilometers away, reachable only if the column kept moving. But movement became slower and slower. Some women stumbled repeatedly. A few collapsed. The risk of death by exposure grew with every passing minute. American soldiers had faced blizzards before, but moving a weakened column of prisoners through one was another matter entirely. Every choice carried consequences. Attempt to wait out the storm and risk fatalities, or push forward and navigate with almost no visibility. Neither option promised safety. The fear expressed in a single sentence, "Don't let us die here," was not theatrical. It reflected the real, documented danger of winter warfare in the final months of World War II. Entire units suffered frostbite without firing a shot. Trucks froze to the ground. Field hospitals ran out of blankets. The cold became an enemy as lethal as any weapon. And as the column struggled through that white curtain of snow and wind, the storm forced a reckoning with the war's wider collapse, a collapse that had pushed these women from desks and signal stations into the heart of a dying front. Everything that happened next grew from the chaos of that final winter and the conditions that shaped it. It leads directly to the broader landscape of early 1945, the terrain, the weather, the military confusion, and the policies that governed the treatment of POWs. The winter landscape of early 1945 was shaped not only by the storm itself, but by the strategic geography stretching across the Western Front. The Ardennes region, already infamous for its dense forests and steep ridges, became a maze of snow-choked paths where even experienced soldiers struggled to find their bearings. The same terrain that had shielded German counterattacks now turned into a trap for everyone moving through it: retreating Germans, advancing Americans, and the thousands of support personnel caught between collapsing lines. Road networks that had once supported rapid movement were reduced to single narrow tracks carved through deep snow. Convoys stalled on inclines. Jeeps and half-tracks skidded into ditches hidden beneath frozen drifts. Foot patrols discovered that even short distances required hours of slow, deliberate movement. In reports from the period, U.S. units described advancing as if through a world made of smoke and ice, where the horizon disappeared into a shapeless white mass. For German female auxiliaries who had never been trained for frontline conditions, this environment was overwhelming. Many had been stationed in heated communication bunkers or administrative posts before being ordered to withdraw toward the Rhine. When their assigned transport broke down or was destroyed, they were forced to march along roads already clogged with retreating units. In those weeks, thousands of displaced personnel, combat troops, nurses, clerks, wounded soldiers, flowed through the same limited corridors, creating confusion that made it easy for groups to become separated or stranded. American forces advancing into these regions were equally affected. Patrols frequently came upon abandoned wagons, frozen horses, wrecked German vehicles, or groups of stunned prisoners who offered little resistance. Among these were women from the Luftwaffe Signals Corps, the Wehrmacht clerical branches, and the Red Cross. For the U.S. Army, their presence presented a logistical challenge. They had to be processed, guarded, fed, medically evaluated, and transported away from active operations. Under the Geneva Convention, female POWs required separation from male prisoners and additional provisions to ensure their safety. In ideal conditions, this meant transferring them swiftly to rear area camps operated by military police units. But the conditions in early 1945 were far from ideal. The rapid American advance during the push toward the Rhine stretched supply lines thin. Some divisions were advancing faster than support units could follow. In this environment, ad hoc holding areas, barns, schoolhouses, abandoned German depots, were used temporarily until transportation became available. Blizzards made these procedures far more difficult. U.S. field reports from the period record that several prisoner movements had to be halted due to frostbite risk. Marching weakened POWs in sub-zero temperatures was dangerous even for short distances. Commanders issued directives warning patrols not to expose captives to unnecessary risk. But the reality of the battlefield meant that weather sometimes forced decisions no one wanted to make. The group involved in the Blizzard rescue was almost certainly one of these temporary detachments, a small American escort responsible for transferring a handful of German female auxiliaries to a more secure area behind the lines. They were likely several kilometers from the nearest aid station, operating along a secondary forest road with the expectation of a straightforward march before nightfall. Then the storm struck, harder, faster, and more violently than predicted. Whiteout conditions erased every sense of direction. Compasses became unreliable when soldiers lost their ability to distinguish trees from shadows or road from sky. Even trained U.S. infantrymen found themselves struggling to remain oriented. For the prisoners, most of whom lacked proper winter clothing, the storm was immediately life-threatening. Wind chill could drive temperatures low enough that exposed skin froze in minutes. A fall into deep snow could sap body heat instantly. The women's pleas were not symbolic. They were grounded in the stark reality that people could die simply by standing still too long. It was in this exact type of storm that American medical units reported rescuing German civilians, disoriented soldiers, and even their own men. Hypothermia does not discriminate by uniform. And in those conditions, the line between captor and captive blurred into a shared struggle for survival. Yet the Americans escorting this group understood their duty clearly. POWs were their responsibility, regardless of circumstance. Preserving their safety was not an act of generosity. It was a legal and moral obligation, one that many U.S. Praetian units upheld even in the most hostile environments. Still, the storm forced decisions faster than training manuals could account for. Should they stop and attempt to build shelter? Should they push forward in hopes of reaching a known farmhouse used as a temporary rest point? Should they split the group to find help? The choices were few, and each carried its own danger. This blizzard, this night, was not an isolated event. It was part of a wider winter phase that had already cost both armies hundreds of lives. What made this particular moment remarkable was not the storm itself, but what happened inside it. The collision of desperation, duty, fear, responsibility, and the raw human instinct to protect life when the elements threatened to extinguish it. All of these historical threads create the foundation for understanding the rescue. Now, to grasp the full weight of what occurred, the event must be examined from several distinct angles. Winter warfare is an adversary that fights without pause. In early 1945, Both armies documented thousands of non-combat casualties from exposure alone. Frostbite could occur within minutes when skin met the open air, and hypothermia could slip silently into a person's body long before they realized they were in danger. For the German women in this column, the storm magnified every weakness they carried into captivity. Days of poor nutrition, long marches without rest, thin clothing, and the psychological collapse that came with defeat. German female auxiliaries were never trained for survival in combat conditions, let alone in a whiteout blizzard. Many wore standard-issue wool skirts or thin trousers beneath lightweight coats. Some carried gloves, others did not. Their boots, designed for administrative work, soaked through quickly. As the storm strengthened, the women faced the same physiological threats soldiers feared most: numb limbs, uncontrolled shivering, slowed thinking, and the creeping fatigue that often precedes collapse. The first women who slipped into the snow were not weak. They were experiencing the predictable failure of the human body in extreme cold. For the American soldiers escorting them, each collapse intensified the urgency. They knew what hypothermia looked like. They had seen their own men fall victim to it in the Ardennes. And now, enemy or not, these women were their responsibility, placed in their care by the rules of war and the expectations of military conduct. The storm was stripping away the distinctions of nationality. It was reducing everyone to the same fragile human form, struggling to stay alive. Blizzards in the Ardennes could immobilize entire divisions. Visibility sometimes dropped to less than a meter. Snowdrifts could hide ditches, wrecked vehicles, or frozen bodies. Under such conditions, even experienced scouts risked walking in circles without realizing it. Navigating a column of weakened POWs became a tactical problem that no field manual fully prepared soldiers to solve. The American escort likely had a general route in mind, a forest road leading toward a rear area checkpoint or a temporary holding facility, but the storm distorted every landmark. Trees vanished into the swirling white air. Compass readings became unreliable as soldiers struggled to orient themselves in a world stripped of shape. Voices were carried away by the wind. Even the sound of footsteps seemed to disappear beneath the roar of the storm. Terrain that once seemed straightforward became dangerous. Snow concealed routes that could trip a person instantly. Frozen slopes became slick surfaces that drained energy with every ascent. If the column stopped, its members risked freezing. If it continued forward without precision, they risked wandering into the forest and becoming lost entirely. American soldiers were taught to prioritize movement in severe cold, to keep marching, to keep breathing hard, to keep circulation flowing. But moving with prisoners slowed everything. They could not abandon the stragglers. They could not break formation. They could not risk scattering in the storm. Every tactical decision had to consider the safety of the entire group. The storm turned this escort mission into a tactical rescue operation, demanding rapid decisions from junior officers who suddenly found themselves balancing military duty with elemental survival. U.S. Army field medics in 1945 were trained to respond to cold weather injuries with the same seriousness they applied to bullet wounds. Frostbite required immediate intervention, warming with body heat, removing wet clothing, preventing refreezing. Hypothermia required shelter, calories, and insulation. In a blizzard, however, conditions stripped these steps of predictability. Medics had to improvise with whatever they carried in their packs: blankets, ration tins, morphine syrettes, bandages, canteens, and sometimes nothing more than the heat of their own bodies. Carrying weakened POWs through deep snow demanded immense physical effort. Soldiers used a variety of ad hoc methods recorded in field reports: two-man carries across shoulders, improvised litters made from branches and greatcoats, dragging sled-like shapes carved from debris, forming human chains to keep the group intact, lifting prisoners one at a time over obstacles. These tasks were grueling under normal circumstances. In a blizzard, they became heroic acts of endurance. American units responsible for escorting prisoners were often under-equipped for winter emergencies. They carried limited blankets. Medical supplies were rationed. Vehicles were scarce. And with the storm halting Allied air support, there was no chance of rapid evacuation. Yet the U.S. soldiers persisted, motivated not only by duty, but by the simple recognition that a human life, enemy or not, should not be swallowed by a storm without a fight. Their logistical decisions were shaped by the immediate reality: reach shelter, keep the prisoners alive, and protect everyone from becoming another casualty of the winter. These angles reveal the intertwined physical, tactical, and logistical pressures that defined the blizzard rescue. But there are still deeper perspectives: leadership, propaganda, and moral duty that shaped this moment. On paper, escorting a small group of prisoners from one checkpoint to another required little more than discipline and routine. But war, especially in its collapsing final months, seldom followed procedure. Junior American officers in early 1945 were often thrust into situations where the weather, terrain, and unpredictability of retreating German forces demanded rapid improvisation. This blizzard was one such moment, a crisis where leadership became the difference between life and death. The officer in charge of the escort would have faced a torrent of competing realities. Standard protocol required maintaining custody and ensuring safe transfer. Field manuals emphasized prisoner welfare, yet the storm ignored every rule. With visibility near zero and temperatures dropping by the minute, he had to decide whether to halt, push forward, or find shelter off-road. Each choice carrying its own risks. Stopping invited hypothermia. Moving blindly risked disorientation. Leaving the road meant plowing into deep snow or unseen obstacles. There was no guarantee that reinforcements or rescue teams could reach them in time. Yet leadership in such conditions was not simply about choosing the least dangerous path. It was about maintaining cohesion, keeping morale from collapsing, and projecting confidence when nature stripped away certainty. The officers' decisions, ordering pairs to support each other, assigning soldiers to carry the weakest, calling out constant headcounts, were not dramatic gestures. They were the quiet, disciplined practices that kept units functioning under the worst conditions. And in the storm, those small acts of leadership held the fragile thread between survival and catastrophe. To understand the terror in the women's voices, "Don't let us die here," one must consider the psychological world these German auxiliaries came from. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal conquerors who mistreated prisoners, violated women, and showed no mercy to those who surrendered. Young women raised on this rhetoric believed that capture meant humiliation or death. When they were taken into custody, that fear did not vanish. It lingered beneath every step of the march. It colored every glance exchanged between the POWs. It shaped every assumption about their captors. Even when American soldiers treated them correctly, the women's minds struggled to reconcile this with the terrifying stories they had been taught. The blizzard amplified these fears. As the storm worsened and exhaustion deepened, the women's belief that they would be abandoned became more than propaganda. It became an emotional certainty. They were far from home, cut off from their units, and surrounded by a force they had been told to dread. Yet what unfolded before them contradicted everything. Soldiers who could barely see their own hands through the snow were lifting them, warming their fingers, sharing coats, shouting over the wind to keep them conscious. The storm stripped away ideology, leaving only the raw human instinct for survival and the unmistakable realization that their captors were fighting as hard to save them as they were to save themselves. The psychological impact of this moment would echo long after the storm passed, reshaping their understanding of the enemy and of the war itself. The Geneva Convention set the legal framework for the treatment of prisoners of war. But morality often played an even greater role in how American soldiers approached these situations. Many U.S. troops saw their mission not only as defeating the German army, but as proving, through conduct, that they were different from the regime they fought. Humanity was a strategic weapon, one that undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than any leaflet. This moral framework became especially visible in extreme conditions. In a blizzard powerful enough to kill within hours, no soldier could remain indifferent to suffering. The German women were no longer enemy personnel. They were cold, frightened human beings fighting the same elemental enemy that stalked the Americans. Saving them was not an act of charity. It was a matter of honor, of discipline, of refusing to let the storm dictate who deserved to live. Morality, however, did not erase the difficulty of the situation. Soldiers risked frostbite carrying others. They removed their own gloves to warm prisoners' hands. They gave up scarves, blankets, and rations. They accepted exhaustion and exposure because leaving the women behind violated every value they had sworn to uphold. These acts were rarely recorded in official reports. They were not the moments celebrated in victory speeches or battle summaries. Yet they formed the backbone of American conduct during the war, revealing a moral compass that persisted even when the world around them collapsed into frozen chaos. These angles, leadership, fear, morality, complete the framework needed to understand the rescue. They also set the stage for the critical turning point, where the storm intensified and choices narrowed to a single desperate path. The storm did not ease as evening approached. It hardened. What began as sweeping curtains of snow became a suffocating white wall that pushed against the column from every direction. The wind rose with a force that bent tree branches and rattled canteens against belts. Snow whipped sideways in long, stinging ribbons that struck faces like needles. The world narrowed to a few blurred shapes: boots, coats, hunched shoulders, and beyond that, nothing but an endless swirl of white. For the American escort, this was the moment when routine ended and improvisation began. They knew the nearest shelter, a farmhouse or aid post, was somewhere ahead, but the storm had devoured all sense of distance. The path beneath their feet was no longer visible. It had become a shifting slope of snow that swallowed footprints the instant they were made. One German woman stumbled first, her knees giving out as if someone had cut the strings that held her upright. An American soldier reached her in seconds, pulling her to her feet. But her legs trembled too violently to support her. When she sank back into the snow, her breath came out in ragged, uneven bursts, an early sign of hypothermia. He slung her arm over his shoulder and shouted for another soldier to help distribute the weight. Moments later, another woman collapsed. This time, 2 Americans rushed forward, lifting her from both sides, trying to keep her awake by speaking loudly, though the wind swallowed every word. The officer in charge scanned the group and saw what he had feared. The women were reaching their physical limit. Their pace had slowed dramatically. Their steps lagged. Shivering had shifted into that dangerous, quiet stillness that often precedes collapse. The storm was no longer a threat. It was winning. He called for a halt. Gathering his men in the least exposed pocket of road they could find, Snow slapped their helmets. Frost clung to their eyelashes. Even speaking required leaning close so voices could cut through the wind. The choice was stark. If they stayed where they were, the weaker women would not survive an hour. If they turned back, they risked becoming lost in terrain the storm had transformed beyond recognition. If they pushed forward, they had no guarantee the farmhouse still lay where the map suggested. Yet doing nothing was the one option he refused to consider. He ordered the column to reorganize, strongest soldiers to the front and rear, two-man teams assigned to each woman who struggled, a continuous rotation of carriers to conserve strength. Medics moved to the center with blankets and whatever warm items they possessed. The Americans tightened their formation, drawing the prisoners into a compact mass to conserve heat. Then the column moved again, slowly, deliberately, step by step, into a storm that erased the world 1 meter at a time. Wind clawed at them. Snow blinded them. Each soldier leaned forward, pushing his body into the gale as if forcing his way through water. Every 100 meters, another woman faltered. Every time, American hands caught her before she hit the ground. Some soldiers removed their own gloves to rub warmth into frozen fingers. Others wrapped scarves or spare coats around shivering shoulders. The medics checked pulses, forcing chocolate, sugar tablets, or hard candy into mouths that barely responded. The cold was not only stealing strength, it was slowing thought, numbing judgment, lulling exhausted minds toward dangerous stillness. The storm seemed endless. At one point, the officer halted the group again and surveyed their condition. Half the German women could no longer walk unaided. Several Americans limped from the strain of carrying bodies through deep snow. He knew they were reaching the threshold where physical endurance began to fail. And then, faintly, almost lost in the roar of the wind, came a sound that pulled every head upward. A creak, a wooden groan, something shifting against the storm. The officer strained to see. Through the drifting white mist, a dark shape flickered in and out of sight. It could have been a tree. It could have been nothing. But then the outline sharpened. A thick wooden beam, the faint edge of a roofline, a shape too geometric to be natural. A structure. They weren't lost. They were close. He shouted a command, and the column gathered its remaining strength. Soldiers tightened their grip on the women, half carrying, half dragging them. The group moved as one living chain, leaning into the wind until the shadow grew larger, clearer, real. They reached a barn, an old German farm structure weathered by years of winter, but still standing strong against the storm. The officer forced the door open, and the sudden rush of warm, stale air felt like a miracle in a night designed to kill. The soldiers guided the women inside, laying them on straw, removing wet garments, and beginning the first steps of emergency warming. But the storm outside did not subside. And reaching the barn was only the beginning of the most intense phase of the rescue. The true battle to keep everyone alive would unfold in the hours that followed. Inside the barn, the first wave of relief was immediate, but fragile. The storm hammered the wooden walls with a force that made the structure tremble. Wind hissed through gaps in the planks. Snowflakes drifted in through cracks under the roof. The air was warmer than outside, but not by much, just enough to pull the prisoners back from the edge without guaranteeing safety. The barn was a temporary refuge, not salvation. The American soldiers moved with deliberate urgency. They cleared a space in the center of the floor, piling loose straw to form insulation. Helmets, canteens, and rifles were set aside as the men focused on the rescue effort. They wrapped blankets around shivering shoulders, removed soaked boots, rubbed numb limbs, and checked pulses with hands that were barely warmer than the ones they touched. The German women, overwhelmed by exhaustion, offered little resistance. Some cried quietly. Others lay still, staring blankly at the wooden beams overhead. One woman drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragments of prayers or names of people far away. Another clung to the sleeve of the soldier tending to her, too weak to say anything, but unwilling to be alone. The Americans knew that warming someone too quickly risked permanent injury, but doing nothing risked death. Medics paced the barn with practiced determination, examining each woman in turn. They lifted frozen fingers, checked for skin that had turned waxy or pale gray, signs of deep frostbite. They forced sips of lukewarm water into mouths barely able to swallow. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow piled against the barn door, sealing it shut. Wind screamed across the roof, rattling every beam. The world beyond the walls had vanished entirely. The officer in charge took stock of his men. Several were shaking uncontrollably. One soldier sat against the wall, chest heaving from carrying two women across a stretch of deep snow. Another rubbed his hands together so violently it seemed he was trying to force warmth back into his bones. Every face held the same haunted expression, exhaustion mixed with the dawning realization that they might be trapped until morning. But duty did not end because conditions worsened. The officer ordered a rotation. One group tending to the women, another group resting for strength, and a third reinforcing gaps in the barn walls with whatever materials they could find: old boards, broken crates, sacks of grain left behind by the farmers who once lived here. Hours blurred into one another. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting. The temperature inside the barn hovered just above freezing, enough to prevent immediate death, but not enough to reverse the damage already done. A medic knelt beside a woman whose hands had turned an alarming shade of white. He removed her gloves and examined her fingertips. Frostbite. The early stage. If she lived, she might lose parts of her fingers. He wrapped them carefully, securing them beneath layers of cloth and a wool scarf donated by one of the soldiers. Another woman had stopped shivering, a sign not of improvement, but of worsening hypothermia. Shivering was the body's last defense. Its absence was a warning. The medic leaned close, checking her pulse, speaking softly even though she likely could not hear him. He instructed two soldiers to sit on either side of her, using their own body heat to keep her stable. Time moved slowly, measured in breaths and heartbeats rather than minutes. At one point, the officer stepped outside to assess the storm's severity. He pushed the door open only a few inches before a blast of wind and snow nearly drove him back. It was like staring into the mouth of a white abyss. He forced the door shut, bolting it with a wooden bar. No movement was possible. The storm had sealed them inside a cocoon of ice and darkness. The night wore on. Inside the barn, the faint warmth of shared body heat created a fragile atmosphere of endurance. Soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, some with prisoners leaning against them, others wrapped in blankets, with 2 or 3 women pressed close for warmth. Enemy lines no longer existed. Nationality had dissolved into a shared struggle against a cold powerful enough to erase all differences. Slowly, subtle signs of improvement emerged. The color returned to a few faces. Shivering resumed in those who had stopped. A medic whispered that one of the weaker women's pulse had strengthened slightly. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Sometime near dawn, the storm's scream softened into a muffled whisper. The wind eased, Snow settling against the roof fell quiet. A gray light pressed through the cracks in the walls. Thin, hesitant, but unmistakably the light of morning. The officer rose stiffly, joints aching, and opened the barn door. The storm had passed. Outside lay a world remade by snow, white drifts sculpted into ridges, trees bowed beneath icy weight, and the road barely visible beneath its frozen covering. Behind him, the barn was filled with exhausted bodies, Americans and Germans alive, because they had endured the night together. The rescue was complete, but its consequences, medical, psychological, and historical, were only beginning to unfold. The storm had not only tested their strength, it had altered the course of lives, reshaped perceptions, and quietly rewritten the narrative of captor and captive. What followed in the aftermath would reflect both the cost of the night and the power of the moment that bound them. Morning revealed both the scale of the storm and the cost of surviving it. When the American soldiers emerged from the barn, the landscape appeared almost unreal, an expanse of white dunes sculpted by the night winds, stretching as far as the eye could see. Trees were bent under the weight of ice. Fences and road markers vanished beneath smooth ridges of snow. Even the footprints the group had left the previous evening were gone, erased completely. If they had been only a few minutes slower the night before, the trail would have disappeared while they were still on it. Inside the barn, the German women woke slowly, their bodies stiff from cold and exhaustion. Some could barely lift their arms. Others struggled to speak, their voices reduced to whispers by the effects of hypothermia. Breathing was shallow, movements cautious. Yet each woman who opened her eyes represented something extraordinary. Survival under conditions that could easily have claimed every life in that barn. The American medics moved quietly among them, performing careful assessments. They checked pulses, tested grip strength, examined skin for discoloration, and noted who needed immediate evacuation. A few cases were severe. One woman's fingertips were a mottled blue, deep frostbite that might require amputation. Another had fallen into the early stages of rewarming shock, the dangerous period when cold blood moves back toward the heart and can trigger sudden collapse. But the majority were stable enough to travel with assistance. Reports from the period describe similar incidents: sudden blizzards forcing makeshift medical stations, soldiers and prisoners sheltering in barns or cottages, and medical teams improvising treatments with limited supplies. These episodes rarely appeared in official histories, but they reflected the chaos and humanity woven into the final months of the war. After a brief rest period, the officer in charge organized the evacuation. Soldiers fashioned makeshift stretchers from farm doors and blankets. Others reinforced footwear with strips of cloth or spare socks. The strongest women walked between guards who steadied them when their knees buckled. Those unable to walk were carried in pairs, their weight shared between 2 or 3 soldiers who rotated frequently to avoid exhaustion. Their destination was a small U.S. aid station several kilometers away, a converted schoolhouse staffed by medics, nurses, and clerks. Even under normal weather, reaching it would have taken an hour. On this morning, the journey stretched into several. Deep drifts slowed their progress. The sun reflected sharply off the snow, forcing soldiers to squint. Every few minutes they paused to check the women's condition, ensuring no one slipped back into unconsciousness in the cold air. When they finally reached the aid station, the American personnel there reacted instantly. The women were ushered inside, placed near stoves, and provided with warm drinks and blankets. Nurses documented body temperatures, noted symptoms, and ordered immediate treatments. Frostbite cases were logged, hypothermia protocols activated, and medical tags affixed to each individual. For many of the German women, this was the first time they fully understood what had happened the previous night. They had assumed the Americans would prioritize their own safety, especially during a storm that threatened everyone equally. Instead, they saw U.S. soldiers limping from exhaustion, their uniforms soaked, hands raw from cold, yet still assisting the very people who had been their enemy hours earlier. The contrast between propaganda and reality could not have been sharper. Nazi messaging had portrayed Allied forces as cruel, vengeful, and indifferent to suffering. Yet here, in a schoolhouse filled with warmth and quiet urgency, the German women witnessed a system built on procedure, compassion, and discipline. Their rescue was not a special exception. It was the predictable outcome of an army trained to uphold duty even when conditions made it nearly impossible. Medical notes taken that day recorded the women's symptoms and recovery prospects. Some faced long-term nerve damage. Others would require extended rest before regaining strength. But all were alive, a fact that carried weight far beyond the frozen fields outside the aid station. The blizzard had forced an encounter that could not be undone, an experience that would linger in memory long after the war ended. What came after? The psychological impact, the dismantling of wartime myths, and the larger meaning of the rescue formed the second part of the aftermath. For the German women who survived the blizzard, the hours and days that followed were marked by a mixture of disbelief, physical recovery, and a slow unraveling of the ideological framework they had carried into the war. The schoolhouse aid station became more than a medical facility. It became the setting where years of propaganda collided with lived experience. Some of the women wept when blankets were placed around their shoulders. Others stared in stunned silence at the medics tending to frostbitten hands and feet. A few asked quietly, almost apologetically, why the Americans had carried them through the storm instead of leaving them behind. The answers were simple. They were prisoners. Their safety was the responsibility of the U.S. Army, and no soldier was permitted to abandon someone in their custody to the elements. Duty, not sentiment, had guided the rescue. Yet the women struggled to reconcile this with what they had been taught. They had spent years hearing warnings that the Americans were ruthless, that capture meant humiliation, that surrender meant cruelty. The reality in front of them was different. It was structured, calm, and governed by procedures designed to preserve life. The contrast was so stark that several women later described the rescue as the first moment they understood how profoundly they had been misled. American personnel observed these reactions with a mix of professionalism and quiet empathy. Many had seen similar responses from other German prisoners, men and women who had been raised on a system of fear and discovered, often painfully, that their expectations had been built on distortions. But the intensity of the blizzard rescue made this psychological shift more immediate, more concentrated, and more visible. Medical reports filed in the aid station noted the physical effects of the storm. Frostbite of varying degrees, moderate to severe hypothermia, dehydration, and fatigue. A few injuries would leave permanent marks, scarring, loss of sensation, or the amputation of fingertips. But the greater transformation occurred internally. Each woman had faced death in the storm. Each had been carried by someone she believed would show no mercy. Each had woken in a barn surrounded by men who risked their own lives for hers. Outside the aid station, the war continued its collapse. American forces pushed closer to the Rhine. German defensive lines fractured. Civilians fled westward in long columns. But inside this small building, the pace of war slowed. Nurses arranged cots. Medics prepared warm meals. Officers processed identification documents. Names were recorded, ages listed, occupations noted. The women were assigned to sections of temporary POW camps designed for female internees, where they would remain until transport was available. The rescue became a quiet point of discussion among the American soldiers involved. They spoke about the storm, the weight of carrying bodies through the drifts, the fear that the barn might collapse under the wind. But they rarely framed it as heroism. For them, it was simply what duty demanded. A task carried out because failing to do so was incompatible with the values they represented. Some of the German women, once settled into the POW system, wrote letters to families if postal routes allowed. Others recounted their experience to fellow prisoners, describing the storm with a clarity shaped by survival. These accounts circulated informally, contributing to a broader shift in how German POWs perceived their captors. When the war finally ended, many would recall the rescue as a defining moment, proof that the world outside their propaganda was more complex, more humane, and more disciplined than they had been taught to believe. For the U.S. Army, the incident remained an unrecorded footnote in a campaign full of larger battles, dramatic offensives, and strategic turning points. Yet within its quiet details lay truths often overlooked, that war tests not only strength and strategy, but moral resilience, that survival sometimes depends on those once labeled as enemies, and that, in the harshest environments, the boundaries between sides can blur into shared purpose. As the women recovered and the soldiers prepared to return to their units, both groups carried forward the memory of the blizzard night, a memory shaped not by combat, but by a struggle against the unforgiving cold, and by actions that preserved lives when nature had nearly taken them. This brings the narrative to its final stage, the broader meaning of the event, and the reflection it offers on war, humanity, and the fragile line between life and death in winter. In the vast landscape of the Second World War, where millions were uprooted and entire nations reshaped, the rescue in the blizzard might seem like a small event, an isolated moment tucked between immense battles and sweeping offensives. But history often reveals its deepest truths, not in grand victories, but in the quiet intersections where humanity endures despite the war surrounding it. The storm had been a force indifferent to uniforms, allegiances, or ideology. It cared nothing for offensives or propaganda. It punished without hesitation and reminded every soldier, every prisoner, every witness that survival in winter demanded cooperation more than conflict. What happened in that barn was not a military triumph, nor a symbol of strategic success. It was a moment where duty aligned with compassion, where the laws of war met the instincts of the human heart. The German women who survived the blizzard carried forward a memory that would outlast the war itself. The realization that the enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of mercy, discipline, and sacrifice. For many, it became the first crack in the hardened shell of wartime ideology, revealing the simple truth that humanity persists even when war tries to extinguish it. For the American soldiers, the night offered a different lesson. They had been trained to fight, to advance, to hold ground. Yet in the storm, their mission shifted from confronting an adversary to safeguarding lives that had been placed in their care. Their actions that night reaffirmed a principle that extended far beyond tactics or orders: the belief that moral responsibility does not end at the edge of a battlefield. As the war drew to its close, these individual acts, rescues, kindness, shared hardship, quietly accumulated into a broader legacy. They shaped memories, altered perceptions, and carried forward reminders of the fragile, resilient thread that connects people even in the midst of destruction. The blizzard eventually melted. The war eventually ended. But the night in the barn remained, preserved in the recollections of those who lived it, a moment where enemies became human beings and where survival was earned not through dominance, but through the simple refusal to let another life slip away into the snow.